But I think with the oceans, obviously it's a complicated world and it's getting more complicated by the second. But at least for the environment and for the oceans more specifically, I think it is possible to articulate that vision of abundance and start to be very strategic. If net positive gain is what we're aiming for, then let's be very strategic about how we're going to get those gains, because conservation can be very vague. It sort of sets up a zero-sum game. I want to cut down the forest. You want to protect it. One of us is going to win. One of us is going to lose. And the environmentalists are not winning every match. And so we are losing every year more and more. No matter how much we're winning, we are losing more than we're winning.
Good evening and welcome to your library, a virtual library this evening. I'm David Leonard, president of the Boston Public Library and moderator and host of our Public Conversation series. Tonight is the second of our series of 4 Lowell Institute-sponsored conversations, this season under the theme of climate action, climate justice, which we are calling You Are Here, Climate Change and What's Next. Tonight's conversation is being offered as an online experience only. Thank you for joining us live or for watching the recording. We are once again thrilled to be offering this series sponsored by the Lowell Institute and produced in partnership with the GBH Forum Network and the BPL Programs and AV team. For more information on supporting this and our other programs, please visit the BPL Fund at bplfund.org. Most especially during this month of April, Library Appreciation Month. Our guest this evening is Alexandra Cousteau, a member of the esteemed Cousteau family. She is herself a descendant of legendary diver and environmental educator, Captain Jacques Cousteau. She has herself been a global explorer from a very early age, could swim before she could walk, was taught to dive by the captain himself. She is also the co-founder of the organization Oceans 2050, an organization whose work and mission we will learn more about this evening. Alexandra, welcome to the program.
Hello, it's wonderful to be with you tonight.
Thank you. Where are you coming from so our viewers know where we're conversing from?
Well, we live in the western part of France, in the Loire Valley. So it's quite lovely. We're very happy here, but it's also nice to be able to travel and get back to the States once in a while and see my family there. And obviously the States has played a huge part in my own childhood and life, as my mother is American. So I always have that kind of bridge between the two continents that I like to go back and forth on. So, yeah.
And indeed the ocean in between that we will be
exactly.
So we always like to get to know our guests a little bit in terms of their own personal history and story before getting to the substance of the topic. Would you you have a very famous last name. Would you tell us a little bit about your family and growing up, and we'll go from there?
Yeah, well, so my grandfather was possibly at the time the second most famous man in the world for several decades, second only to Muhammad Ali, I think. And that was because after the Second World War, when the world still didn't know what was under the surface of the ocean, and they were recovering, from the war and figuring out how to move on from that. My grandfather was in that same position. He was an intelligence officer in the French Navy. He was part of the French resistance. He had this very adventurous and daring military career that ended when the war ended. And that was when he and my grandmother, Simone, went and they were able to obtain the Calypso. They got some early funding to go on some expeditions in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. He wrote The Silent World. He made this film, The Silent World, which was really the first time anyone had seen the ocean, what was under the ocean. I mean, people at the time still believed in sea monsters. So this was an earthquake for people around the world to really start to see what was there and understand it. And and be in awe and wonder of the ocean really started in the 1960s. And my father had really joined my grandfather in filmmaking at a very young age, and was his right hand, his best friend. They worked very closely together for many years until my father was killed in an airplane accident on expedition in his plane that he had equipped for expeditions. And my father was the one, interesting, that had started to notice the degradation that was appearing in the oceans in the 1960s and started to articulate this conservation ethic for the ocean. That was really the first time we'd ever talked about the importance of protecting the ocean as a resource, as a place that has intrinsic value, as an important resource for human communities, and something that we had to manage sustainably. And in the 1960s, of course, we still had 90% of the ocean. Most of the losses that we've incurred in the oceans happened over the past 40 or 50 years, to the point where today we've lost half of the blue natural capital in the ocean. That is to say, the fish and the whales and the life in the ocean has diminished by 50%, which puts us in a really different position than the position that my grandfather was in when he first started exploring the oceans in the 1950s.
It's very interesting to me that even in the 60s, referring to your father, Philippe, correct? Discovered that there was degradation already in evidence at that point in time. What did that look like during their travels and their exploration?
That looked a lot like pollution, a lot of pollution. Overfishing was just starting. Interestingly, overfishing accelerated in the 1980s with the invention of new fishing gear, nylon nets instead of cotton nets, refrigeration boats, and radar. Like, suddenly we're able to target fish with military precision and go out there with giant boats that can fish 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, offload onto a refrigeration ship that would then take them to port while the fishing ships keep fishing, and with complete transparency on what's happening in the ocean and where the fish stocks are. So the degradation and the loss of life that we've seen in the ocean has really happened since the 1980s, in my lifetime, which is incredible to think about. But when I was a little girl, my grandfather and my father took me on expedition from the time I was 6 months old, and so I really followed them, from one place to the next, being part of the crew and soaking it all in. And then my grandfather took me to dive for the first time when I was 7. And that was an incredible experience because I had always known what my family did. I'd seen it, I'd been around it. But when my grandfather took me diving for the first time, and I had this extraordinary experience underwater, and there was this school of silver fish that came and kind of surrounded me, and it was like being inside of a firework. The sun was coming in through the surface of the ocean and shining off their little bodies, and they were moving in unison, and that was when I understood why my family was doing what they were doing, and that was a big shift, and I think from that moment on, there was just never anything else that I wanted to do. It was just kind of a straight road from there for me, even though I didn't know what to do, but I knew what I wanted to do. I just wanted to do what they did. I wanted to continue being part of it. I wanted to fight for that. They gave me a wonderful example of what it looks like when you live with real purpose and a real mission and a real desire to have a positive outcome from what you do. And so that was always kind of baked into me as well. I sort of sometimes joke, David, that they brainwashed me at birth, and maybe they did, but yeah, there just wasn't ever anything else. I
Well,
wanted to do.
it sounds like they exposed you to new environments, whether it was different places around the world or the ocean itself at 7. In your bio, it does state, you were able to swim before you could walk. Is
Yeah,
that
it's true.
it's true?
It's true. It's true. Yeah, we kind of lived between Paris and Los Angeles because the Cousteau Society had editing teams in both places. And so, my mom is American, born and raised in LA. My father was French, of course. And so we sort of went back and forth when I was little. Um, and I just remember sitting in the editing suites back when they had the film, and the film would go through these big wheels on either side of a little screen, and they had these red wax pencils, and so they would turn this dial back and forth to get the exact place in the film that they wanted to cut, and they would actually cut it, and they would cut out that section of film and then reconnect the ends, tape it, and hang the piece they cut onto this kind of little rack they had on the side. And I would sit there on their lap while they were editing these films for just hours at a time. And it was just another way to live the adventure when I wasn't with my family. And no, it was very influential.
Was it the love of the oceans and exploration that came first, or was it the filmmaking, or was it both together? I'm just interested to are we thinking of your parents and your grandparents as oceanographers, as explorers, or as filmmakers? Maybe it's both.
My grandfather was all of those things from a very young age. And so he, as a child, loved to make films. Like he would make black and white silent movies when he was 14 years old. And he was born in 1910. So like this is in the 20s that he was making his own movies with like the very, very first cameras. And he was fascinated to take things apart and put them back together again. And he was very much a Renaissance man. He could play the piano, he could write poetry, he could, invent things. He made films. There was just so much that he could do and do well. And he understood very early on in his desire to make films about the ocean that he would have to invent the tools to do that because they didn't exist. And he invented scuba diving, underwater lights, underwater cameras. And his first cameras were those old, 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter cameras that they would put in bell jars and take down and film that way. That was how he started. And then he just kept developing those tools, and then he got the Calypso, and so he was extraordinary. He understood so much about science, but he never considered himself a scientist. He was an explorer. He was a diplomat. I mean, he could go anywhere and meet with anyone, and there were times when I went through customs in Canada a number of years ago, and there was an older person who was looking at my passport, and they remembered when they had checked my grandfather going through and had sort of recognized him and said, "Oh, Jacques Cousteau, come on in," and didn't even check his passport because, he was
completely recognizable.
Yes. It was a long time ago as well. Things were different then, but yeah, I think he was able to touch people with his films. His films were never about the environment. They were always about the human adventure on the Calypso of the crew in these places. And so people experienced the places through the experiences of the crew. And so it was, in a way, the first reality show. In some ways, it was very much a human experience. And so people often say, wow, I always dreamt of being on the Calypso and being, part of the crew and sharing those experiences. And I think that was part of what made the adventure itself translate into an emotion that people could share.
Just describe the Calypso for us, for those that may not have seen some of the films or want to visualize that for themselves as we're chatting.
Well, the Calypso, it was an old minesweeper from the Second World War made out of Oregon pine. It was built in Portland, I believe, and it was a double hull minesweeper. So it was long and very narrow, and it wasn't very big. The ship itself wasn't very big at all. and my grandparents had a cabin, and then it was like dorms. And one bathroom, my grandparents had their bathroom, and then there was like another shower bathroom for the crew, all men. And I think they might have had a guest cabin, but it wasn't a big ship. It seems larger than life in the films, but it wasn't that big. And the other thing that was fun was when my grandfather, he realized very quickly that Hollywood would be the place where he would be able to get his films made. And so he went to Hollywood. He met with one of the very early documentary filmmakers named David Wolper. And David said, okay, Jacques, I get what you want to do, and it sounds great, but you're going to have to jazz it up a little. Like, you need to make this something that's going to be interesting to watch. And so my grandfather went, and that's when he yellow stripes on the side of his black wetsuits, and he made these special helmets with lights on it, and he put a slide off the back of the ship so the crew could like slide into the water with their cameras head first. He put an observation bubble on the front of the Calypso. He jazzed it up and went back to David Wolper, and David said, okay, you got a deal. And I think that it's picked up by ABC possibly. I know ABC had it for a number of years, but yeah, and at the time they had a huge budget. It was like $1 million per film, which in the 1960s was a lot of money. He was also the only one doing it, so it wasn't as crowded a space as it is today.
And this was before any of the, modern technology or gear for diving or submersibles or even traversing the ocean. So that sounds both exciting and a little scary at the same time.
Well, and I think we have a photo of my grandfather with one of the submarines that he invented, which he is called La Puce in French, the flea in English. And so this was one of the submersibles that he had helped to develop, because he wanted to go deeper and he wanted to see what was down there and stay longer. And in order to do that, he had to invent his own tools. And so,
and how deep would that go?
Deep.
Like,
I don't remember, David, but we're talking
beyond,
like, yeah, like 1,000 feet, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. Amazing. And so as a 7-year-old, you fall in love with this experience because it's what your parents and grandparents have been doing, but you also, I think, have this experience of going underwater that is like visiting another world, another planet.
Yeah. And at the time, we spent a lot of time in the south of France and elsewhere, and there was an abundance that doesn't exist anymore. It was common for me to see octopus and things just along the coast in the south of France, and you don't see them anymore. There were tide pools that I went to as a child that were just brimming with life, and when I go back there now, they're gone. They're slimy with algae, and nothing lives there anymore. So my experience, throughout my life has really been experiencing the loss of these places that I knew as a child and that I had spent time with, and a lot of like creatures kind of felt like my childhood friends because I, saw them so much.
Where are
and
they
now,
all?
Well, now going back, it just feels like I'm surrounded by ghosts, and so I don't actually dive as much as people assume because I don't want to see diseased coral. I don't want to go on a dive and be excited that I saw one trumpet fish, or it's just so that's been really as formative an experience over the course of my life, seeing that disappear as it was to have it as a child and have it shape my desire to be in this world. And so when my daughter was born, I really had the sense that she might be the generation of my family to write the obituary for the oceans. And that was, I don't even know how to explain that feeling of just grief and disappointment and utter disbelief that we had somehow gotten to this point. And one day I called a friend of mine Professor Carlos Duarte, who is my reference for so many things in this community, and he is one of the most, if not the most, published marine ecologist. He's a distinguished professor, and really just one of the truly extraordinary scientists about oceans. And I asked him, I said, Carlos, is it inevitable? Tell me the truth. Is it inevitable that by 2050 we'll have more plastic in the oceans than fish, that my children will be writing the obituary of the ocean, and there's really nothing we can do to get to a different place where we can rebuild our oceans to what my grandfather once knew? Is that a pipe dream? And he said, no, actually it's not. We are doing a study right now on how we can rebuild marine life by 2050 to the abundance that we had before. And we're finding that it is actually scientifically possible to do that. And we're building that roadmap to get there. And that for me was transformational moment, because I realized that this conservation ethic that I had grown up with and that had done so many important things, don't get me wrong, the conservation ethic helped us to, create the EPA in the United States, which was a landmark move, and that other countries then, created ministries of the environment that were very much modeled off of the EPA. And there was all of these other things that we accomplished with this idea of protecting what we have. And yet you can never protect 100% of something. You're always going to have losses. And so that means that with 1% loss every year, eventually you get to where we are today. And where we are today is scary in a way, because in nature, and we saw this with like the coronavirus, you have exponential curves, right? And so with the oceans, we're going along, we're losing more and more and more a little bit every year. We're getting to half the ocean is gone. In another 10 years, once we reach 60%, we'll start to have tipping points, and we'll start having exponential curves down. And that's going to be really scary, because it's hard. When your plane goes into a nosedive, it's really hard to pull it up. We need to correct before we get to that point. And so now is the time when we can start doing certain things to rebuild what we've lost. And that's a fundamentally different pathway, but that's a pathway where we can actually experience an exponential curve in the right direction, right? Where we start seeing life come back. And the wonderful thing about the ocean is that it has these incredible powers of regeneration. And we see this over and over and over again with like overfished fish stocks. You have these examples of fisheries that have fish that they get overfished and then they crash. And if you just stop fishing them for a few years, especially with the sardines and smaller fish like that, they bounce back, and you get very quickly, you get their populations to come back. And so the ocean does have a much more regenerative power than land. And I think that that's where we actually are inhabiting our lucky moment in time. And I use that expression because when my grandfather was asked by people, what made it possible for you to do what you did? He would say, I just lived in my lucky moment in time when who I was, what I was passionate about, what I dreamed of doing coincided with the television being invented, but not a lot of programming. Technology being good enough that he could invent SCUBA and he could invent all these other things. The oceans weren't degraded yet, so there was still a lot of story to tell. Like there was just all of this kind of came together at the same time and made it possible for him to do what he did. And I think we today now have that same lucky moment in time when technology, AI, data, we have all of these things that have improved our lives in all these different ways, whether it's the everyday tools we use on Uber and Amazon and Airbnb, that allow us to do very complex things very easily. But we also have the ability to explore from space using satellites, to be able to analyze changes in the world on a day-to-day basis throughout the world. There's just all these amazing things that we can do with robotics. And if we look at, the science, what the science tells us, and the kinds of technologies that we have today. And finally, the fact that so many people are waking up to the need to not just protect what we have left, but to rebuild, then we have this people power, I think, today that we never had before for the oceans. And I think if you look at all of those ingredients together, you very quickly find yourself in a place of hope that is not optimistic, that is realistic, if we take the steps and we do the work that we need to do now.
Right. I mean, it can't be false hope or just,
No.
Leave it to the universe to resolve.
To figure out, yeah.
You just walked us through, I think, in the last few minutes, this arc of seeing, the conservation approach as being a possible antidote to simple pollution in the middle of the 20th century. Through to realizing that simply isn't enough, and that you're advocating for restoration, and not just restoration of what has been lost, but a restoration to a level of abundance, which is a very powerful message. But you're balancing, on a knife edge. It sounds like what you said about your daughter maybe having to write the obituary of the oceans. And by the way, that's the planet as well. We'll talk about that in a second. But with these new technologies, what year was that conversation approximately with Carlos Duarte? Was that the person that you mentioned?
Yes,
and like the tipping point around this opportunity.
For me, it really was, and it was the first. So much of the science that's done is really an accounting of what's going wrong. And that's important. We need to know what's going on, but very little science is actually proactive in figuring out how we solve these problems, where the opportunities are, analyzing what steps we should take that are going to have the greatest impact, and helping us figure out a roadmap to that future. And so this article in Nature called Rebuilding Marine Life, and I shared a link that I think we can put into the chat, was one of the most cited climate papers of 2018 in the top 5. It really was an earthquake. Tons of press around the world were covering what they wrote about, and this realization that it's not too late. Science, it's clear that there's still a window of opportunity for us to not just stop the bleeding, but actually heal the patients. And that's an important realization to have. And I've seen a lot of organizations start to model their strategies from that science. And it was Carlos who led the paper, and then there were other scientists who were working with him on this, who are also world-class scientists. So it really was like an extraordinary brain trust of experts who came together to look at it from this perspective. And it was, I think, one of the most important contributions of the last 25 years in the ocean space was to start talking about how we rebuild what we've lost.
And does that lead in your life to then the creation of the Oceans 2050 project and organization? Would you draw the dots for us on that, if you would? Yeah.
So Carlos and my husband and I started Oceans 2050. In the name is really our goal that 2050 will not be the year that we write the obituary for the ocean, where it will not be the year where there's more plastic than fish in the ocean and all those other things that we've heard, but that it will be the year where we start to get abundance back as an outcome of the choices that we make over the next decade. And it's been really encouraging, because even back in 2018, I was one of the first people to really talk about restoration of abundance as kind of the new narrative that we need to start articulating, both within our ocean community, but also with the larger public. And now, a lot of people are talking about it, and that's really, and I'm not saying it's because of me, but I'm seeing that this is a message that is starting to, be more abundant, be more common. We see it more and more often, and in fact, in the recent Montreal Protocol, the Cummings Montreal Protocol that was agreed upon by 140 nations a few months ago, we saw that there was this language about rebuilding what we've lost, not just about putting 30% aside for nature, but also about rebuilding 30% of degraded ecosystems, both on land and in the ocean. And that's new. And it's very ambitious. I mean, it may be too ambitious, but and there's probably not enough money that's been allocated to do that yet. But there's other places that we can find funding if we all kind of adopt that as our mission, as our objective, as our KPIs. And I think I've long believed that to get to a better place, we need a vision of where to go. And my ski instructor, when I was a little girl, he'd take me up to the top of the bunny slope in the Alps and cross my skis and say, okay, Alexandra, when you go down the slope, make sure you look at the bottom of the hill where your mom is. Right? Don't look at the trees, because if you look at the trees, you're going to ski into the trees, and that would be bad. Right? And I just remember this idea that you have to get to where you want to go, you have to look in that direction. And I feel like we are really, in the States and Europe and so many parts of the world, we are looking at the trees. And we're not looking at, we're not articulating and shaping this vision of where we want to go so that we can all work together to get there. And I think with the oceans, especially, our feet, exactly. But I think with the oceans, obviously it's a complicated world and it's getting more complicated by the second, but at least for the environment and for the oceans more specifically, I think it is possible to articulate that vision of abundance and start to be very strategic. If net positive gain is what we're aiming for, then let's be very strategic about how we're going to get those gains, because conservation can be very vague. It sort of sets up a zero-sum game. I want to cut down the forest. You want to protect it. One of us is going to win. One of us is going to lose. And the environmentalists are not winning every match. And so we are losing every year more and more. No matter how much we're winning, we are losing more than we're winning. And so zero-sum games are always tricky. And I think when we start to look at how we rebuild abundance, suddenly we're looking at omni-win solutions. And that's where, I was an international relations major at university. So sometimes I look at things through that lens, but it's true that if we find a way for everybody, or at least a majority, to get what they need, not maybe everything they want, but what they need, then we can find a way forward that is going to create that abundance. And in an abundant world, we are healthier, we are happier, and we are more prosperous. Our communities are protected. We aren't having to flee our homes. Like there's just a lot of benefit to us as people when we have an abundant environment that can mitigate the impacts of climate change, provide food security, provide protection from storms for coastal community, all of these things.
Well, I think speaking of being able to visualize abundance, we have that wonderful picture of you as a diver with this massive school of fish behind you, just off of Pebble. And it may be a little simplistic illustration of this concept of abundance, but I think it just makes it possible to see what the richness of the ocean is. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to start diving in 2008. And that's now 15 years ago, and can already see some of the change. But there's nothing like appreciating this kind of experience, I think, for realizing not just what's possible, but what our obligation should really be about.
Yes, and Cabo Pulmo is in Mexico, near Baja, and it is a tiny little marine reserve, like very small, very small. But what they've seen in Cabo Pulmo has been this extraordinary resurgence of marine life. And so you're able there to see an abundance of sharks, an abundance of jacks, which are the fish that were in that photo, just an abundance of life. And so it's become a very popular tourist place, and they're starting to be able to build like hotels and dive companies are moving in there, and it's creating a very sustainable local economy in Baja for the best of reasons, and the fishermen are also benefiting because there's the spillover effect. So while they're not fishing in the marine reserve, fish don't know about artificial boundaries that we create, and so the fishermen are able to benefit from the spillover effect. And if we were able to do that at scale, and that's what I mean about restoring abundance and everybody winning, there's no reason that we can't actually fish more fish in an abundant ocean than we are today. Right now, our fisheries are collapsing all over the place because we're not fishing sustainably. We're fishing the maximum amount that we possibly can without the stock crashing, and they often do crash. And then we have to stop fishing them for a number of years so they can come back, and it's just this horrible, horrible system where the quotas are not set by scientists; they're set by fishermen. With a very short-term focus. But we know that if we set the right quotas and we listen to the scientists and we create marine protected areas and all these things, then we could be fishing more than we are today. We could feed more people in a hungry world a healthy protein meal every day. Like, there's a lot of benefits that would come from that. But in order to do that, we have to have that abundance mentality. We have to work together to make that possible.
So maybe let's spend a couple of minutes on the different threats to the ocean health as a whole. We mentioned pollution early on as one indicator. I think briefly you touched on plastics as a form of pollution. I think that's more complicated than most people probably realize, and where plastics are showing up both within fished fish as well as bottom of the ocean. We have the acidity levels in different parts of the ocean around the world. We have the rise in temperature and effects on coral reef. Are these interconnected? Are there particular dimensions of those threats that you'd like to highlight?
Well, climate change, I think, is threat number 1, 2, and 3. It's having huge impact on the ocean, impact on the ways that we experience it are increased severity of storms. Because of the heat in the system, it creates hurricanes that are more powerful, typhoons that are more powerful, storms that are more powerful. So that leads to loss of life and property and huge economic devastation to coastal communities. Another climate-related problem with the ocean is sea level rise. I mean, that doesn't need much explanation. Obviously, it's going to be a problem. We see Indonesia has decided to move their capital city from Jakarta to another location because the flooding is so bad that they just can't live there anymore. And it's not going to be the last. So Miami might be next. They're already kind of having problems with saltwater intrusion and flooding and stuff, and it's just going to go faster and faster every year. We also see changes in the currents, and that's going to be really problematic because when the currents change, we have what's called kind of a pump, and so it cycles water around the ocean in its very specific way, and that carries nutrients. It kind of circulates hot and cold water. It's connected, to where animals live because those currents bring nutrients to them. And so you'll often find, seals and seabirds and stuff living in places where those rich, cold waters come up in these upwellings to the surface, and that's where they can find food. We hear about the devastation from El Nino and La Nina. It's kind of, the kind of problem that we can expect to have with the shutdown of these currents. We're also seeing with the heating up of the water, so the water temperature is going up, we're seeing species migrate. That might not seem like a big problem, okay, so fish are moving north. But for certain fishing communities, the fact that their industrial stocks are moving to other countries means that they don't have access to them anymore. One of the examples that is close to you is the lobster.
Yeah.
Lobsters used to go all the way down to New Jersey, and now they pretty much start in Maine. And that's very specific to climate change and colder water. And that species needs a certain temperature range to feel comfortable and to live out its life cycle. And so they're moving north. And Maine lobstermen expect that in the next 20 years, they will have moved out of Maine and they won't have a lobster industry anymore. So they're starting to look at alternatives. They're growing kelp in the off season. And some of them are expecting to become full-time kelp fishermen as an alternative. So there's geopolitical issues involved because you need legislation to manage a fishery. And if you have a new stock in your waters and you don't have legislation, it just is very complicated. So those are some of the issues, but then we have other issues like coral reefs, which are incredibly important ecosystems. And I can talk about why they're important to the ocean. They are sort of the rainforests of the sea. They are nurseries, even for pelagic species. They come and they lay their eggs and the juveniles live in the security of the coral reef before they move back out into the open ocean. But they're also a source of food security for hundreds of millions of people around the world. They provide economic income for local coastal communities around the world through tourism and diving. They act as a barrier to severe storm events. So, they break the waves and prevent flooding and damage from occurring on land. So actually insurance companies are starting to look at what they call blue infrastructure, which is coral reefs and mangroves, and restoring those to help protect those coastal communities. So coral reefs suffer a lot from heat. They heat stress and acidity, which is a direct result of the carbon dioxide getting absorbed by the ocean and turning into carbonic acid in the ocean, which can dissolve limestone type structures, whether it's corals or even plankton. Certain types of plankton can suffer from that. Oyster fishermen are finding that their oyster larvae are not developing properly, and they're having massive mortality rates because the larva, the water is too acidic for the larva to make the leap from a larva to an oyster and start building their shell, because the shell just dissolves. And so corals, are going to require a lot of concerted effort and funding and innovation to be able to stop them from dying off by 90% in the next decade. So we have a lot of serious problems. There's a lot there.
You've just painted a pretty bleak picture of multiple challenges all materializing at once. So, I kind of need to shift the conversation to why isn't there a greater sense of urgency? Do we not understand the implications or the interconnectedness of these problems? Because basically, if we lose coral reef, we lose the ecosystem of sea life in the oceans, which means we lose the ocean's ability to be part of our world. It's 70-80% of our planet. And then we lose everything else. So do you have an analysis of why that's just not a more compelling reason to act?
It is pretty amazing when you think that oceans, so Sustainable Development Goal number 14, life underwater, oceans is the least funded of the SDGs. Maybe there's one other one, I don't remember which one it is. I think human institutions or something like that is actually less funded than the oceans, but it's stunningly underfunded by everyone. And that's always been puzzling to me, because the oceans are so critical to our survival in this world. But that's been something that's been true for decades. You look at the funding that NASA has to send a rover to Mars to take photos of something, and we're seeing the photos in real time across like 140 million miles or something, and yet we don't know what's at the bottom of the ocean.
A lot of plastic, apparently.
So. A lot of plastic, yeah, but also a lot of other things, and we're talking about deep sea mining, and we don't even know what we're mining. And we don't know the damage that it's going to do. We don't know the outcome. We haven't done that work to really to figure that out. And we're going to send down like huge drills and things to like churn it up and tear it up and take out the nodules. And we're not even sure that we need it. Like, we may be able to have our phones and everything else and not destroy the bottom of the ocean. We haven't figured that out yet. The mining companies are just kind of creating this gold rush mentality for deep sea, and
we know how that worked out on land as well. So
yeah, and I was really proud of President Macron here in France, because he recently said, like, we need a moratorium on deep sea mining. We need to stop it, and so I think there's a lot of like momentum in that direction, but we don't have this, I think, enough of a concern and a narrative about the oceans. And that's not to say people don't love the oceans, because we do love the ocean. People love to live by the ocean. They love seafood. They love the ocean. They love diving, sailing, whatever it is. But when it comes to understanding the survival of that ocean, so we're not surfing on a dead ocean. We're not eating, aquacultured salmon, which is gross. Like, if you know about that, gross, because we don't have any wild salmon left. Like, we don't, and I think part of it is the media that isn't communicating these things. It's sort of, if it bleeds, it leads. And so let's, grab a headline with something that's really scary, rather than talking about all these success stories and all these new technologies and all these people who are doing amazing things and all of these reasons to think that we can actually win this thing. Like, we don't talk about that. We really only talk about all the things that are going wrong. And so I think it's important, and I think we should talk about also what those things are, because I think there is a clear pathway to get to that different outcome and to get off of this pathway that we're on, to move to a different place. But we're not talking about it. We're not investing in it. We're not looking at it. So, for example, one of the projects that we've been working on recently is seaweed. And seaweed is the stuff that we step over walking down the beach. I fully appreciate that. But the thing that's interesting about seaweed is that it is a form of agriculture that humans can practice that is restorative to the ocean. So kelp forests and different kinds of seaweed. It's not the slime that we don't like. It's actually an extraordinary plant that reoxygenates the water, deacidifies the water, provides habitat for all kinds of different creatures, and provides livelihood for communities around the world, whether it's indigenous communities in Alaska. In this photo, these are Indonesian communities that are practicing seaweed farming. This is a source of income for the entire community. Oftentimes, seaweed collectives are run by the women in the village, and they hire their husbands to come work with them, and they're able to invest in their community, invest in their children. And so we were looking at the impact that seaweed farming can have on carbon sequestration, and understanding how much carbon do seaweed farms sequester, because we need to know right now, like, what the tools are in our arsenal to be able to mitigate climate change and start to offset the negative impacts of CO2. And we found over the course of this now, we were severely impacted in the pandemic, but our cohort of partner seaweed farms was like Alaska to a 300-year farm in Japan to farm in Chile, Norway. We had, 27 farms that represented thousands of seaweed farmers from around the world. And they were all taking core samples in the sediment under their farms, and sending that back to the lab. And they were testing that sediment to understand how it sequesters carbon. And it turns out that some seaweed farms, not all, it depends on currents and sediment under the farm and all of these different things, but some seaweed farms can sequester more CO2 than the Amazon rainforest. Like it's extraordinary how much. And that's because when the seaweed like kelp, for example, grows faster than anything else. It grows faster than bamboo. And as it grows, it sheds leaves. And when those leaves fall into the sediment and get buried, it sequesters carbon. It also, as I said before, it absorbs carbon dioxide out of the water. It releases oxygen back into the water. They're looking now at putting seaweed farms near oyster farms, near aquaculture farms, because of how they can benefit water quality and everything like that. And it's been fascinating to see the interest of new communities that hadn't previously been interested in oceans, who have taken an interest in seaweed because of this climate angle. And we're right now writing a voluntary climate carbon protocol for seaweed farming, so that those farmers can benefit from that service that they're providing, and where having those carbon credits that they can sell makes all the difference in the world to them being able to do this. I mean, maybe not to the farmer in Maine, although they are interested in it as well, but to farmers in Indonesia and indigenous farmers and stuff, that income could make all the difference and help them weather, fluctuations in the market and help them to expand. And we want them to expand. Like we need more seaweed farmers because it's has such a hugely positive impact on the ecosystems and on the communities. And what we've learned is that we could expand seaweed farming by 2,000% in the oceans without having a negative impact on existing nutrients in the ocean. So there is a lot of room for, expanding this in a very sustainable way that has no negative impacts and only positive benefits to the ocean and to those communities. And, they're finding now that you can use seaweed not just to eat, even though it is really healthy, but you can make plastic packaging out of seaweed. You can do all of these things with seaweed, fuel and fabric and nutraceuticals and cosmetics and all these things out of seaweed that would displace damaging feedstock for those industries and replace it with a regenerative feedstock, which is pretty extraordinary. So seaweed is one of those things that is really exciting, because as we look at the acceleration of the blue economy, which is how we make money off the ocean. There's obviously the exploitative, damaging blue economy, which is oil and gas and deep sea mining and overfishing and everything, which is how we currently make money off the ocean. But there's a lot of cities and countries that are looking at a regenerative blue economy. How can we create economy through wind, through seaweed, through innovation and R&D and different things, and seaweed for them can really be a cornerstone of that regenerative blue economy that can be part of bringing abundance back to their coastal zones, enriching the community and that the marine environment. So there's a lot that we can do to get on a different path, and we're not focused on it enough.
That is a wonderful, hopeful example of where a transition, maybe like we can borrow the phrase of just transition from one form of economy to another that gets applied, that is both restorative, is interesting, and as you say, has no negative effects. I think mangroves are another area where there is a great net positive impact on
absolutely
the carbon issue. Before we take some of our questions from our audience, though, as we were prepping, you told me about some of the work around coral restoration that I think is absolutely fascinating. And one more example of where, if we have the will, there is interesting technology and interesting restorative approaches that really could bring about the vision of restoring abundance that you imagine.
Absolutely. And I corals are very difficult, much more difficult than seaweed or mangroves, because they are sensitive to acidity, they're sensitive to temperature, they're slow growing, and we've lost, half of our corals as of now, and we're looking at the loss of another 40% by 2030, as early as 2030, because of these heat waves that we're seeing. And obviously, if we've been paying attention, we've seen like the extreme weather events happening in the United States. It was happening here. We had horrible forest fires here in France and Greece and, Spain and Italy, droughts that wiped out the olive oil industry. And even olive trees are struggling, you're in trouble. And so those extreme weather events have an impact on the ocean as well. And corals are especially susceptible to that. But when, our chief scientist went to the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon a few months ago, he was really disturbed by the level of ambition that was being articulated by a lot of people in the coral community of, let's save what we know we can save. Let's build Noah's Ark of corals so that we have genetics on the coral species from when they get wiped out. Like, it was just a very negative, defeatist, kind of sad state of affairs, very sad conversation. And he found it to be rather pathetic. And I would have to agree that if at this point in time, that's how the community that is studying this is reacting. I don't think it's because, I think that there's a lot of grief involved because it's hard to be a coral scientist today because you're watching them die off, and it's hard to go into an ecosystem that you've known and loved and studied for years and see it bleached and empty. Like, that is emotionally very taxing. But at the same time, I think it's important that we muster the courage to be extremely bold about where we are finding solutions. And what I haven't seen in the coral community is a real focus on just deploying the kind of technology that we're deploying in every other aspect of our society in, solving this problem. And so, we're taking coral fragments for the most part, hanging them on like strings underwater where they grow out, and then they're replanted into the reef. This has very limited success in some areas, more in others, but it's no guarantee of success, and it's extremely slow. And so you're losing more corals globally in a day than you can replant in 10 years using that approach.
I mean, that sounds more like a pilot program to discover what's possible and what might work rather than a scalable solution.
Yeah, it's
not
a scalable
technology.
Solution.
Right.
No, it's not a scalable solution. But like, we haven't fully explored how we can use, AI combined with like data and analytics and robotics. I mean, imagine if we were able to do, and I've seen people that are working on this and starting to think through this, and we're part of that process. But imagine if you have 3D scan of a reef where you can zoom into the coral polyp level, right? This is possible. And you have your digital tool that's scanning that, identifying the best place to replant a certain species, because not all species get along. Sometimes they fight, and you don't want to plant those species next to each other. You want to plant species that like each other next to each other. But AI can do that. They can scan the reef. They can identify the best places to put different species of corals. You can load up a drone that can go in, drill a hole in that place on the reef to plant the plug. We can now 3D print corals. We can do silicone molds using limestone that then, when you put fragments of corals, it kind of covers it very quickly. So in a matter of months, you can have like the equivalent of a 50-year-old coral, like the size of a 50-year-old coral that can get outplanted. And using these robot drones, we could go much faster for much cheaper, like 24 hours a day, than we can with divers, because that's the most expensive part of it. So people are working on these solutions, and I think we'll get there. But that's the kind of thinking we need. Like, we need to be really ambitious. When it comes to seagrass, we can't be like planting one little sprig of seagrass at a time. We need to have, drones that can plant a football field of seagrass in a day, not 5 square feet of seagrass in a day. And we're not there yet in restoration. And it's really important that we get there quickly. And again, we're working on that. We have partners who are working on that, investing a lot in that. But I think for me, when we talk about ambition, we need to be ambitious. We need to have vision. We need to have a shared idea of what we want to accomplish. We need to work across disciplines. For example, one of the things that we did, my husband's an architect originally, and he had these connections to a studio that built 3D models for architects. So when you see, an image that is an architectural rendering, there'll be a lamppost, or there'll be cobblestones, or there'll be a tree. So it's these kinds of studios that build those models that architects can put into their images. And he called them and he said, we want to be able to 3D print corals, but we need the kind of variation, the kind of natural variation that you would find in nature. We don't want to just put clones, right, with 3D print, the same 5 versions, for the whole reef. And they were like, oh yeah, well, using our technology, which is like embedded in a gaming platform, they can build all these things. We can give you a million different versions, right? And we use these algorithms that scientists developed for, the natural growth patterns of corals in different conditions. And then we just enter that into the algorithm and it'll spit out like a million different versions of what would be a naturally occurring coral growth pattern. And so now our scientists, our marine biologists, are working with them to figure out how you can do this. And then you have like a real natural, kind of collection of coral babies that you can put out there that are already of a certain size. And it's really exciting to think about how we can innovate in this space using the expertise of different industries that aren't traditionally involved with ocean restoration, but where, unlike in conservation, where it's really a very specific toolkit of policy change and fighting the bad guys and doing social media videos and doing legislation and all these things which are really important. When you look at restoration, it's a different toolkit, and there's a lot of innovation that we can have there with a lot of different industries who probably would love to be part of something like this. And I think the more we can invite them to come and be creative and find solutions that really push the boundaries of what we think is possible. And I just really feel that that's where we're going to be able to reach the scale of change that we need.
What, this will be my last question before, I've incorporated some questions into our conversation already that we're getting, but what gives you most hope on the global cooperation front? Because our oceans do not have their own borders once you get into international waters. And so it really strikes me as it's not up to one country alone or one group alone, but rather it requires global cooperation. And I'm just wondering what gives you hope at that level, aside from these great innovations and experiments that you've mentioned in the last 10 to 15 minutes.
Well, you see initiatives like 30 by 30. So 30 by 30 is this idea that we need to protect 30% of the ocean, like really protect it by 2030, so that we have the capacity, we're building in capacity for the ocean to regenerate, to give it places where it can breathe, where species can come back, where we can start to rebuild abundance. And that's gotten a lot of momentum. There's countries that, most countries have committed to 30 by 30. A lot of them have, are even planning to surpass it. So Panama, for example, wants to protect 50% of its ocean. Chile and Canada went from like 1% to 12% or something crazy just in the past 5 years. So there's a lot of momentum behind putting these marine protected areas aside. There's new tools also, that like digital tools that are monitoring existing marine protected areas and identifying areas that are just paper parks, so parks on paper and not in practice. And that's really important, because you can create legislation that creates a marine protected area, but if people are still using it for fishing, and you're not doing anything about it, that's a problem. But a lot of countries don't have the resources to do anything about it. They don't have the boats or the Coast Guard or the ability to go out there and actually intercept the illegal fishing. And so being able to have tools like Global Fishing Watch and the Marine Park tool to identify where the illegal fishing is happening, where the marine parks are not being properly managed, so that we can either intercept that illegal activity, or provide better protections is really important. And there's a lot of momentum going in that direction. So I think there is more and more collaboration. As I said, the Cummings-Montreal Protocol, 140 nations committed to this. It's the first time we've had that kind of language and that kind of ambition for oceans. And so there's, we have the recent UN treaty on the high seas, which was like a decade in negotiation and was finally negotiated. And so we're starting to see some things at that level that are really exciting. And I think, again, when we have the ability to monitor illegal fishing from satellite, we've got a whole new kind of world of tools at our disposal to start managing the oceans in a way that we just couldn't before. The open ocean was the open ocean. It was, nobody knew what was going on. It was no man's land.
And we've had a couple of questions related to the fishing dimension here that you're touching on. One aspect highlights this question highlights the tension between local fishermen, the fishing industry, and tourism. For example, we're seeing a question come in about we've done some protective work, the seals are coming back, then the sharks are coming back, and the beach closed, and so to me that reminds me that all of this is just interconnected. The questioner is asking, do you have examples of where this reaches a new harmony in a new world, and a new interconnectedness between maybe tourism, fishermen, and the ocean's needs?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've found that, for example, sharks are worth more alive than they are dead. And that's because of tourism. There's a whole group of people, myself included, that love diving with sharks or manta rays or whales or, whatever it is. But when you have, a thriving ecosystem, you're able to attract a lot of people who want to see that and who will pay good money to have that experience. When you have more abundance, you have more fish for fishermen, you have more fish for hotels, for consumers. Healthy seafood. I don't eat it. I'm a vegetarian, but it's an important source of protein in the world, and it's one of the last wild sources of food for us. And properly managed, it can be, an absolute legit, protein source in a world where we do need to cut down on some of the other things that we're doing for protein, like cattle and stuff. So I think what we will find is a new balance with nature when we've recovered that abundance. We will find new opportunities to produce food, to have economic activity, to have livelihoods for local people, to have, certain protections against, a lot of, like, as I said, insurance companies are investing in planting mangroves in certain places because it helps protect property and people's lives. But it's a different balance when you have abundance than when you have scarcity. And that's not to say that you're not going to maybe have to deal with a few more sharks on the beach, but the truth is there's a lot of sharks on the beach and we just don't see them, right? And they don't do anything. And when you look at aerial images of beaches and you see sharks kind of swimming right offshore and swimmers aren't aware of them, they're not doing anything. It's very rare, actually, that they attack people.
Most of them are friendly or scared of humans anyway.
Yeah,
so.
they're. I mean, I personally, I love them and I love being in the water with them. And it's harder and harder to find them because they're getting fished for their fins and for trophies and stuff at an unsustainable rate. But it would be great if we had more sharks in the water. Let's just put it that way, and it wouldn't necessarily be harmful to people.
I mean, the craziest looking shark creature underwater is absolutely the hammerhead shark. To come
Yeah.
face to face with them, it's like, wait a minute, who made that, and where did it come from? So,
But they're so shy, and that's what people don't realize is my friends who are underwater filmmakers, when they want to film the giant schools of hammerheads, they have to use rebreathers, which is where instead of exhaling bubbles, those bubbles get kind of scrubbed through a special system in back, and then you breathe. It's a rebreather. You rebreathe that air, so there's no bubbles. Because if you exhale bubbles in the middle of a school of 600 hammerheads,
like, oh, right.
they will disappear in a heartbeat. They're actually really shy creatures that really don't like humans. So yeah, I think a world with more sharks would be a wonderful place for many reasons.
I mean, the whale population is the various whale populations are the other big indicator of the larger sea creatures that we should be paying attention to. One of the most actively watched challenges is the plight of the right whales, certainly off the coast of New England and a couple of other spots around the world as well. These are populations that are really on the extinction list. So
they are, and it's really sad. They're called the right whale because they were the right whale to kill, because when they die they float. So they were targeted by the whalers, and they were lighting the streets of London for many years with whales,
right.
oil.
Right.
And right whales are really having trouble coming back. They're getting entangled in crab lines, and they're getting ship strikes, and it's really tragic. There is cross-border collaboration between the Americans and the Canadians trying to fix this problem. And there's new gear for crab pots that doesn't entangle whales. So, if we adopt that, it'll be better. Get the ships to slow down, which is really hard. It'll get better. And that's a sad story. But the good story is that other species like humpbacks, some scientists estimate that they're back to their pre-whaling numbers. There's a lot of humpbacks in the world. That's really exciting. There's a lot of gray whales in the world. They're really coming back. And so we're seeing kind of the positive side of, the creation of the International Whaling Commission and the end of whaling, and, the last time before plastic, and plastic being the most recent example of general public outcry. But before that, it was in the 1970s. It was the Save the Whales campaign that was started by Greenpeace and others. And nobody had seen a whale necessarily, but they all felt that they wanted to live in a world where whales existed. And it really made a difference. And we're seeing the benefit of that through the abundance of these other species. And I think that we can have that same expectations if we do certain things now, that in the next 30 years, we can recover things that feel like they're slipping away from us now. So
this becomes an example of where ocean fishing regulations and international cooperation actually does pay off. I mean, without taking care of the bycatch problem that you're referencing with crab fishing and so on, it's a mixed bag. That was one of our questioners was noting that the whales in the Atlantic had been depleted in the 1800s and came back. So I think there's both examples from past centuries as well as current centuries of where that kind of intervention is working.
What's interesting, David, is with the whales, something that people don't consider is that whales sequester a lot of carbon, because they fertilize they come up to the surface to poop. And when they do that, they basically fertilize the plankton, and the plankton, absorbs a lot of carbon, and then they sink to the bottom. And so whales sequester a lot of carbon. And so when we're looking at blue carbon and valuing blue carbon, whether it's seaweed or whales, there's actually a way to monetize this carbon sequestration so that we can fund the work that needs to be done to protect and restore them. So we're seeing investors have an interest in oceans in a way they never did before, because suddenly the financial mechanisms are starting to be developed to allow them to participate in a way that is interesting to them, right? And that's really, really, really cool. I think we want more mechanisms that allow people to participate in ways that are feel native to their occupations and their interests. And up until now, an investor who loved the oceans didn't really have a way to invest in oceans. But now, because of climate change and because of these different models and these different protocols and systems, we're seeing a lot more investors who want to put their money in rebuilding oceans. So that's kind of exciting.
Is that different than what I would call the first wave of carbon offset mechanisms, which, were people really taking credit for things that were already getting done, as opposed to new investments in offsets or sequestration projects?
Yeah, so that what you're referring to is additionality, and that is where you need to be able to show that what you're investing in is actually additional to what would happen anyway. And that's sort of one of the criteria now that everybody's asking for in the carbon market. And don't get me wrong, there's reasons for concern in this carbon market, but we've seen with trees, for example, that being able to sell credits for planting trees made it possible for many more trees to be planted than would have been planted otherwise. And then you don't need it as much because you've had that first influx of funding that made that action possible. And then it kind of creates its own momentum. And so with seaweed farming, we're hoping that with this voluntary carbon protocol and the ability to offset carbon with seaweed farming will inject capital for project development into the space that wouldn't go there otherwise, and get it to a maturity where it can create its own momentum.
And your own work at Oceans 2050, are there a couple of highlights that you want to just share with us where you're focused? Our conversation tonight has really spanned the entire gamut of possibilities, but I think there are a few platform or planks of your platform that you might want to share. One of our questioners is asking about the role of marine protected areas in particular.
Yeah, so well, I already talked about the importance of 30% marine protected areas by 2030. And I think that's the biggest initiative we have globally around that. And there is, it is widely recognized that that is one of the most important things we can do, is just leave some parts of the ocean untouched. Like, let it come back there, let it breathe, let it exist. And we can benefit from the overflow. We can benefit from those things. So marine protected areas are definitely one of the most important strategies, and one that has a lot of momentum now. It's really exciting to see. We're very interested. Obviously, we've been doing this work in carbon sequestration through seaweed farms, understanding the science of it, understanding the opportunities for investors and project development, and supporting local communities. It's important to me. A lot of 60% of the farmers in our study, that was like 20,000 people, are part of this cohort of farms that were part of our study. 60% of them are women. So, we're also looking at the social benefits of seaweed farming for the community, for women. How women spend that money is different than how the men spend that money, because typically women will invest more in their children, they'll invest more in their community, they'll make sure that their local clinic has a maternity bed, they'll just do different, they'll provide pencils and paper for the local school. There's an interesting way that the capital flows when it flows through women, which is different than when it flows through men in these coastal communities. And so we're trying to understand how seaweed farming, especially through that gender lens, can have a larger positive impact on the community, because it's typically women's work. But when the husbands are out of fishing because it's overfished or whatever, they will go and join their women, and it'll become a family affair, which is really positive and really wonderful. So we're looking at that. I think we're interested in kind of the different aspects of that because yes, while we have markets for carbon, I think it's important that we also look at how we can monetize other benefits like biodiversity or, community equity and things like that. How can investors then participate in advancing and creating momentum in those aspects as well? So the idea being that right now we are measuring our success in a way that exploits the ocean, right? Like I'm going to get money if I take fish out of the ocean. I'm going to get money if I mine the ocean. I'm going to get money if I, extract from the ocean. Well, how do we create a financial incentive to be a steward of the ocean, to, reward the restoration of abundance in the ocean through that economic activity? So seaweed farming is one good example, but there's others. And if a seaweed farmer is not only sequestering carbon at his farm, but he's also, augmenting biodiversity at his farm. He's oxygenating the water at his farm. He's creating all of these services that are a public good. He should be compensated for them. And we all have an interest in them doing that. And it creates an incentive for them to do more of it. And so that's where we're kind of interested in all of these other benefits around seaweed. That's one thing that we're doing. We're also really interested in these new technologies that can accelerate our ability to restore different ecosystems, whether it's mechanical engineering or digital, engineering, computer science. Like what are those things that we can innovate and develop that will allow us to accelerate the rate of restoration that we're capable of and bring down the cost so that everybody can have these tools at their disposal. And a lot of that is around corals and seagrass and those kinds of ecosystems.
Well, we're reaching the end of our time together, Alexandra. So, and our conversation has certainly spanned the globe and spanned the planet, as it should. Thank you for the journey through, through your own family and your own experience and what our globe and our species is facing. I'm going to bring it back with a final question, which has two parts. Really bring it back to the individual action that is possible. So, what words would you like to leave our viewers with in terms of what actions they can individually take, regardless of where they are? And we're also wondering what advice you have for us in Boston about what we can do at an individual level.
Well, I think there is, as I said, such a great need for different talents to contribute to this idea that we can rebuild oceans. So we're not going to rebuild them using the same tools we've been using up until now, because if those were the only tools we needed, we would have done it already. So we need, lots of different ideas, different expertise, different industries, different kinds of people. We need to diversify the movement, and we need to make sure that everybody is represented and everybody's ideas and life experiences are represented. So that's, I think, generally something where, if you want to get involved, there's a million ways to get involved. You can volunteer at the aquarium. You can go to town hall meetings and, when they're having a vote on, whether or not to ban single-use plastic, you can, do so many different things. And I think in Boston specifically, like there's real challenges, when in a coastal city. And we're looking at developing an alliance, a Blue Cities Alliance, right now that will kind of bring coastal cities around the world together to be able to learn from each other and accelerate the ability to, restore and rebuild their coastal infrastructure their ecosystems and the connection that citizens have to the ocean. So I think Boston, as a coastal city, has a huge role to play in, restoring their fisheries, restoring their coastal ecosystems, making sure that they're not polluting that coastal ecosystem, managing plastic, banning single-use plastic. I don't know what Boston has or hasn't done on some of those things, but I think that there's definitely groups in Boston working on those issues, and it matters to be part of that, but it's also deeply satisfying. And I can't tell you how many communities I've spoken to where people said, I just started this organization at my kitchen table, and by being part of it, I made friends I never would have made before, and we share the same values and the same concerns. And, it's just enriched my life in so many ways to actually do something about it, because oftentimes we see these things happening. It's painful to watch. It's scary at times. It makes us angry. And then we feel like there's nothing we can do about it. And that makes it even worse. And so I find that even though we're worried about things at a global level, if we can take local action personally, it's very satisfying and very healing, because you feel like you're doing something and you're in a community of people that are doing something. And it's really rewarding. And so I think, I think it's incredibly important to be part of the change, to start somewhere, and then build from there. And I've never met someone who regretted being part of the solution in whatever way they were able to contribute. But contributing something is really the antidote to despair.
So let's band together and be part of the solution as a society and as a global community. Alexandra Cousteau, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for sharing the legacy and the work of your family name and your own work as well. For those of you who have joined us live, thank you for being with us. Thank you to the rest of you for joining us and watching later. Please keep an eye out for our next two programs, and you'll find them listed on bpl.org in this series around climate justice and climate action, as well as a bonus program that we'll be offering for Pride Month in the month of June. Thanks again to the Boston Public Library Fund, the Lowell Institute, the GBH Forum Network, and the BPL's programs and AV teams. So thank you all, and until next time, please be safe and be well. Good night or good day, depending on where you are.